Hello. So I'm going to be responding to some old videos by Philosophy Engineered. I'll be responding to some sentences that he said, which really honestly builds the basis of his whole argument for these videos. The first one is going to be this one, everything wrong with the modal ontological argument. I'll only be talking about one of his premises he makes, which he argues for, but it's actually easy to refute just without looking at the rest of his arguments using math. I'll explain that later. Then in the second half of the video, or if this is multiple parts, in the second part, I'm going to be getting into this, omnipotence, and doing a model of omnipotence and explaining why some of his reasons here are silly. But the arguments overall do not work, and this is actually formalizable. Right. So what are the arguments that this guy makes? So he goes into the modal ontological argument, and he's basically trying to debunk inspiring philosophy. So I'm not sure about the planting modal ontological argument, but I'm particularly this is fine. Okay, good. Well, except for this. But what isn't fine is this. It's partially not fine. So he argues in this point that it's not even possible that God exists, and this is the argument he gives.
It is possible that God exists.
No, stop. First and foremost, no, it is not possible for God to exist. Anytime we talk about a being like God, we're inevitably talking about a being endowed with properties like omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. And as we know all too well, those ideas are riddled with paradoxes right from the get-go, and only get worse when we try to lump them all together into one agent. So no, it is not even possible for God to exist because religious apologists cannot even define that word in a logically coherent way.
So this is true. Logical contradictions are not possible. Contradictions are not possible modally. So he actually needs to qualify this. The logical should be up here, and then this is fine. This is because of the K axioms for modal logic. So modal logic has certain things, right? For modal logic, you can. So I'm gonna. Okay. So here's why that is indeed a good critique. So just for a reminder of what he said. He said that contradictions are not logically possible. So first of all, again, he has to switch the logically to logical contradictions are not modally possible. Okay, so that's the correct way of saying things. But I get kind of what he's saying, but he should clarify. And this is generally why. So the way modal models work is that you basically have a modal model, right? And you have like a set of worlds. This is an example. This is an example of a modal model with modal worlds. I do not have a tablet. So, and then you have these relations, and this dictates what's possible or not. And looks like a category. And so it's endowed with worlds, relations, and V. Right? So you have different possible worlds in your modal model, right? So the axioms for modal logic is K logic. So what this basically means is that each world, right? Like say, let's take W1, it has to satisfy, right? K axioms. So it has to satisfy the K axioms of modal logic. What the K axioms include is two axioms about modal logic and logical axioms just about like logic. You know, you can't have P and not P, right? So each world is a logical world. It's not just a possible world, and like, you know, maybe you can have a world which is illogical. Each world has to be logical, and without contradiction. So this is a correct notion that he's saying here. I think, yeah, there we go. This is the K axioms for modal logic, right over here. You can see it right here, and I'm just going to make it bigger. So these are the K axioms, and each world has to satisfy it. Every possible world has to satisfy these axioms. These are the axioms of logic, and then this is some extra modal logic axiom. So this is indeed true. So if you do find a contradiction with the notion of a God, then it is not possible. Then indeed, it is not possible that God exists, right? Because every possible world must be a logical one, right? However, what I take issue with is this premise: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence are paradoxical concepts. And to that, I would indeed disagree. And this actually uses another ontological argument called the Gödel ontological argument. And I've actually written a paper on this ontological argument for my undergraduate class. So in the paper, I talk about the standard formulation of the Gödel ontological argument, right, which I think fails, right, because of the stuff he actually said earlier in the video was right about the Kantian analytic synthetic distinction, right? This part is correct, right? I think that is a cogent argument, right? And that's why I think the original argument fails, right? As it turns out, though, there's a long history, right? And all of this is cited in the paper right here. You can screenshot and find the papers. But since the original formulation, there have been better formulations of the axiomatic systems, and all of them kind of like stay within the realm of the same thing, right? In either case, all these axioms prove the same thing, right? That God exists. So it doesn't matter, right? I think this also shows that it's possible that God exists. You just need the first three axioms, but I digress. We can go to the Anderson axiom. So this guy called I don't know, his something Anderson, right? Formulated new variants of the Gödel ontological argument to avoid what an issue called modal collapse. What modal collapse is not important right now. Turned out it worked. But this is the variance, and I think this is even better because it avoids the Kantian objection, right? So these are the first three axioms, right? And this doesn't say anything about existence. Anderson actually added two more axioms, which was like the Gödel ontological argument, but it was actually shown by Heijink, right, using formal mathematic methods, right? And it's provable, like 1 + 1 = 2. And also it was provable by AI, right? A proof assistant called Isabel was able to prove this, is Bensmuller, right here. You can see this paper, Bensmuller and Palio. And so it was validated with AI, and of course it's just used standard mathematical logic, right, that this argument works. That's not too important, but just a side note. So with this argument, it actually defines what a godlike being is. And it gives a reasonable idea about what omnibenevolence is. And what the definition is simply seems to be is something is omnibenevolent if every property, right, phi, right, every property of the object X, right, object X is a person, God, for example, me, you, it's a person. So it's a person is godlike. A thing, entity, is godlike. If and only if for every property, a property could be like a property is red, something is green, I'm human, I'm not a cat, that's a property. So for every property, right, if the property is positive, then necessarily God will have that property, right? And then if necessarily God has that property, then the property is positive. And I think this is a formal and cogent way of omnibenevolence, right? As he sees in the video, he uses English, which is an informal way of doing things, and I think is not valid. way of doing things and critiquing things to show that omnibenevolence or omnipotence is not a valid principle, right? And just from this, right, you can actually show that it is possible that God exists. And so the other proof is hard, but this one uses minimal assumptions and it's quite straightforward. So I already elaborated it, and I think this is comprehensive enough. So the proof for this is assume we have a property phi, and assume that it is positive. Then assuming for contradiction, right, that it does not exist, right? There are no it's not the case that it is possible that there exists something with that property, right? Then necessarily it is not the case that there exists a u such that phi is u. The reasoning for this is that the diamond operator in modal logic, one of the axioms is that the diamond operator is equivalent to not, box, not. So then, equivalently from this, not, diamond is equivalent to not, box, not. And then from the principle of excluded middle, and just regular logical axioms, actually, from the Hilbert axioms of math, then the not diamond is equivalent to box not. Okay. So assuming for contradiction there is no such thing with said property, right? Then necessarily there is no said thing for said property, right? Therefore, this is vacuously true because basically, if for every object entity, right, it has that property, then it doesn't have that property, right? Well, this is false, right? This is always going to be false because necessarily there does not exist a x such that this is true. So then this proposition, right, if we do a quantifier elimination type thing where we take an arbitrary, so the way this works is take arbitrary c, right, we note phi c is false. Therefore, phi c then not phi c is true. And the way this works, so I had to explain it to a friend, is this is just a principle used in mathematics, by the way. This is not like something that you can refute. Otherwise, you'll have to refute the entire mathematical community. So this comes from truth tables, where P then Q. If P is false, then P Q is vacuously true. So no matter what the value of Q is, this statement in itself will be vacuously true, right? I can show you the formal truth tables because my friend had a difficulty accepting this. So I'm gonna so in mathematics, this is just a straight up fact, right? So you see here, if this is false, right, it's always going to be true. It's always going to be true, right? I can make it bigger. So this is false, this is false. P, the antecedent, we call that, or just the start, like the thing behind the arrow, right? If that's false, no matter the value of Q, it's just going to be true. So that's called a vacuous truth. Again, I had to explain it to a friend, so I feel like I'll have to explain in general. So this is vacuously true, right? By the axiom 2, right, of the ontological argument, then just plug this in, right? And we get that not phi is a positive property. So we assumed that we have a positive property, but this property doesn't exist, right? This is vacuously true. We plug not phi into this. This becomes not phi. And then from this axiom, we have that not phi is a positive property. As you may think, if you were paying attention, we have this. And that's an issue because that just seems wrong. And the axiom 1, which is intuitive, would indicate that we have a contradiction. Okay. Therefore, this assumption is false. So for every phi, if we have the phi is a positive property, then it must be possible that it exists, right? Okay. Now, being godlike is a positive property. Therefore, it is possible that God exists. I don't want to go into this further, but note that this was peer-reviewed and in an academic journal. So have fun if you want to argue against it. And then also it was proven by an AI assistant. Particularly not like a ChatGPT one, but one that uses lambda calculus and it's just straight up for math purposes. So actually, as we see here, the original assertion that omnibenevolence is not a coherent concept is false. Under these formal assumptions, you actually not only have that it is possible that God exists, but it is actually provable that God exists. Now, you may say, well, the axioms have to be consistent with normal logic, right? Okay. Well, this was also checked by a proving theorem, and this was checked by AI. And it was shown that the original ontological argument, this one right here, the original ontological argument, the one original, this isn't the same one, but I'll get to my argument. The original one, the axioms are actually consistent, right? So it is perfectly possible for the axioms here to also be consistent. In fact, it was probably already proven, but I don't feel like checking it, right? So if the original axioms, the original Gödel ontological axioms were consistent, and the original ones were these ones right here. Oh shit, I keep messing up. The original ones are right here. These were proven to be consistent by a theorem prover, and you can check it actually. You can download Isabelle and then copy and paste the code he used in the paper that I talked about. But these were shown to be consistent. Therefore, one with actually less axioms, and it's very similar to the original one. I hate how this is ordered. These ones should also probably be consistent. There are less assumptions being made here, and they're pretty similar. But I also just I'm just going to take a guess that Ben Smuller, who is the guy who does these things, this guy, Ben Smuller, probably already made a paper on it, and I just forgot about it, and I didn't really care. So, in summa, this video is wrong if we take omnibenevolence to be somebody holding all positive properties, right? Which I think is a reasonable definition, if you want to use logic at least. If you want to use formal logic and you want to critique it cogently. Otherwise, you're not using formal logic, and your argument can be subject to a hermeneutic problem, right? That's what we call a hermeneutic problem, where English becomes ambiguous and it's hard to do things. Somebody called Joseph Bronsky wrote an article on why math is preferable. To mathematize things are preferable. Otherwise, I could just disagree with this video and disagree with what he says, and I don't have to care and pay attention to it. But he does present maybe omnipotence. Maybe that's problematic. Okay. Maybe has an issue. Maybe there is an issue with omnipotence. And that might be a cogent critique, right? And also, there is a sense where he does kind of address the formulation that I gave as possibly invalid, where he just would probably disagree with this formulation because, I don't know, the Bible said so. Okay. And I'll also address that. So where this comes into place is actually this video. Responding to objections about omnipotence. And this is going to be the main subject of the video. Addressing this one. So I'm going to skip around. But I'm going to go through this bit by bit as much as we can. I am doing this on the fly, so I don't know which bits are the ones that are problematic. So, but I have watched some of it. So this one we can skip. And sure, you can assume this. This one I have an issue with, and this is where the problems start. So here he uses script. So, oh yes, this one too. This is fine. He's just doing a historical overview. I do want to note that René Descartes' views have been denounced as heresy in the Catholic Church. You can look at CatholicAnswers.com, and they think that his ideas about dualism is false. I don't know who that is, and this doesn't matter. But this is a fine overview. This is the issue that I take. So let's listen to what he has to say.
Themselves are the ones that have historically tended to support this kind of definition, with René Descartes being probably the most famous example. And honestly, why not? Right? The Bible itself describes God as being capable of doing, quote, all things, and even says so with unqualified redundancy. So it's really no wonder that monotheists across the ages would naively try and hold to this kind of absolutist view of omnipotence. Or, at the very least, if not absolutely, they definitely want to try and get as close as they possibly can within reason. Now, to be fair, the Bible also says that there are things God cannot do, such as lie. Of course, all this really proves is that the Bible is simply inconsistent with itself, and so it doesn't exactly help the Christian to bring this point up in defense.
So, the issue I have with this is his oversimplified view about hermeneutics. What is hermeneutics? The study of hermeneutics is the idea about interpretation of texts, right? It's a problem that in English that you find with interpreting texts and how to understand the meaning of the text, right? Do you take it on the face of what it says? Do you analyze the historical context of the meaning of the text? Do you try to find out what the author originally intended? Or do you do another method? An interesting idea is called death of the author, where you just simply reject authorship intention of the text. And this is an interesting work about hermeneutics. But overall, he's being very simplistic about how to interpret a text. In particular, he says, what that means is the Bible is inconsistent. I'm going to show a simple example of why you wouldn't want to use this hermeneutic method, and it could seem pretty silly. It could still raise an objection to him, sure, but I would give an example, at least an account, why I disagree with this. So I need to figure out which screen capture I'm using. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to it's a very simple example, by the way. The prime example that I'm just going to use, right, is it's going to be quite a gross one, but it'll carry the point. So take the proposition, I love my mother. Okay. Sure. But how about I don't love my mother? Okay. This contradicts, because one says basically, love I my mother. That's a relation symbol to say that I love my mother. And then the other one you could say is not love I my mother. Okay, a contradiction. This text must be contradictory. Okay. How about this, though? Well, you look at it, it still contradicts, because these are two different propositions being said here. One says, I love my mother, pause, she is so caring, right? So if we want to convert this to more logical symbols using model theory, let's try to fit it into model theory. And there's also this book called Formal Semantics. There's this Chomskyan method about semantics. So anyways, the first one is caring, she is so caring, she. And then the second proposition in this text is not love I my mother and is that gross. The and does not affect whether or not these contradict. So this is true, and then this is true. Okay. What this implies is love I my mother and not love I my mother. So it's contradictory. Well, there's a little thing here called context. What do you think love here is referring to? Do you think it's like a familial love, like a caring love, like of course a person can love their mother. Anybody can love their mother, right? As we already established, this seemed like a reasonable assumption, to love your mother. I love my mother. Do you love your mother? We all love our mother. But do you love your mother? No, that's disgusting. You can guess what this means by love, because the love here is not the same as the love here. And this is an issue with the English language, like I was talking about, and the ambiguity of language. There's an inherent ambiguity of language, and you can use you can talk about two different things with the same word, right? In Greek language, there's actually a way to delineate the types of love to Platonic, familial, erotic, and those are the different types of loves. In English, we do not have that distinction of words. We just have love. So in this context, and I don't want to say it, but it's erotic love, as you can probably guess, or romantic, as you could also guess. But in this context, it's familial and Platonic love, right? So if it's okay, you can accept that these contradict, and if you want to be like him, you could say it doesn't matter, they still contradict, right? And you can get up and antsy, right? Or you can be fair to the text, and you can understand the limits of English language, which also Christianity admits, right? We are limited in knowledge, right? That's what we call the ineffability of God, right? And we can only kind of talk about God. The Father, the Son. Are they really the Father and the Son? No. But that gets at a sort of analogy that helps our human minds understand it. You cannot actually describe God, but you can try to describe him. If you want to get at a concept like that, you can talk about qualia and consciousness. Try to formalize the notion of red, for example. What is redness? If you can formalize the notion of redness, try explaining that to a blind person, for example. Can a blind person understand the qualia of red, right? I would argue no. So language is inherently ambiguous, and to reduce these things and to just look at them and say, that's contradictory, is quite silly. Now, this doesn't mean that there can be no contradictions in English. I would argue that if you say that Hamlet, or I don't know, if you say Shakespeare died in, 1512, and then in another instance, in another part of the text, you say Shakespeare died in 1668, and the context makes clear that this is the same types of Shakespeare's, then yes, it does contradict, and I don't think that you can get out of this issue. There's nothing that you can say that can possibly reasonably make it contradict. But to reduce then all contexts to nothing, that is quite silly. And even in this example, right, if we have two different Shakespeares and I want to abbreviate it, I go on a long story about William Shakespeare and I talked about his death. I don't actually know when he died, just X year. And then I just talk about another dude named Shakespeare, right? Like then the next, I don't know, couple of books, I say that I was talking about Alfred Shakespeare, I don't know. And I say that he died in 1979. You take the two books together, are they contradictory? If you know how to use context, no. Now again, there's a nuanced view about hermeneutics that we have to take here, right? And you can't apply that to every situation. If a text contextually talks about the same Shakespeares, then they would seem to contradict, right? And if the texts clearly talk about the same types of love, then they would contradict, right? But to just simply say, oh, that's contradictory, so I'm not going to, that's quite silly. And I would also argue mathematically in this video, I don't even think that you can syntactically say they're contradictory. Not so much as the I love my mother example is syntactically contradictory. Syntax just means letters and alphabets, right? These are literally syntactically contradictory. They are saying the exact opposite of one another. You don't need to dig the meaning of love to understand that they are contradictory, right? Something is substantively or meaningfully contradictory if you dig down the definition of something and you find out they're contradictory. But I would even argue that, first of all, this is a silly view of hermeneutics. And second of all, probably if you mathematically formalize these things, then it is not syntactically contradictory. So I think he's playing a hermeneutic game here that is, any theist can simply reject. And I really it's kind of hard to change his mind because he seems quite close-minded, and he may argue, well, the Bible shouldn't have any contradictions at all. Everything should be formal, precise, and clear. Well, quite frankly, again, when we're talking about ineffability of God, does a person think that it is useful? And we have to understand, what's the meaning of the Bible? Is it for just numbers and quantities and just the absolute formal truth? Or are we getting at for salvific purposes, right? So it's meant to be read by everybody, not just somebody with who is a mathematics professor, right? I say this also to the person in the video. It's been hard for me to try to explain modal logic, right? And how many people, assuming there was 10,000 viewers on this video, right? How many people would actually understand half of what I'm saying? Okay, Do you think that God intentionally wrote a scripture so that it was inaccessible for everybody? If even somebody with Down syndrome ought to be saved, do you think that it is better if the Bible is just gobbledygook, right? Should it just be mathematically formal, or should it be accessible to people with the idea of imprecision? Now, of course, you may argue that, well, if that's the case, then how am I supposed to test the Bible? Well, I would argue this, right? I would argue that the view of just the Bible being the sole interpreter of Scripture is a concept from it's a concept from Protestants, right? Really, and we're talking about history here. He appealed to history earlier in the video, right? Sola Scriptura, which, if you look at history, it only really developed in the 1400s as mainline, right? Most of church history held that the church and Scripture were infallible, and ecumenical councils, or the Pope is Catholic, clarify Scripture. So if you want to resort to, oh, well, that just makes the Bible infallible. Well, that's not the majority view, that the Bible is the clarifier and the interpreter of itself. That is a Protestant notion, which only appeared in the 1400s. There are many problems with Protestantism. First and foremost, it's ahistorical. So you do not have to accept this. And it would be silly to apply a standard to Christians that are modern and invented Christianity, right? As he also it would be contradictory for him, because he actually talks about, oh, well, you're just redefining God. Well, right, you're just redefining God and stuff, right? He argues, he argues like kind of here, right? Oh, you're just redefining God. That's not like, and the kernel of truth that he's getting here is that it's ahistorical. Fair enough, right? But if he's going to apply that standard, then, well, you got to understand that Sola Scriptura was a 1400s development, and that was only in the 1400s where it really solidified as into mainline Christianity, right? So, rules for thee but not me, right? If he wants to apply that, right? And it is totally acceptable to simply say the church is the decider. In particular, the ecumenical councils clarify Scripture, which makes it more possibly inerrant, right? And that is the clarification of Scripture. Scripture helps the laity, and it helps the everyday man, and in every liturgy, every mass, the Scriptures are read to people. They're for the laity, they're for the people. The ecumenical councils are not read to the laity because they are for theologians primarily, and they are for clarifications, right? So I would say, if you want to test the Bible and the consistency, and if you want to do that, then it might be better for you to do ecumenical councils. Or maybe you can debunk Sola Scriptura, fine, okay, but you're going to discount Catholicism, which is actually the biggest sect of Christianity, right, which actually doesn't hold to this view, right? They have this view instead, and it's the historical version of Christianity. So, in summary, this idea of hermeneutics that he applies here, that, oh, it just looks contradictory, so it's bad, right? And this is how we're supposed to interpret Scripture, right? Is quite silly on the face of it, just rationally. And then if you want to object, well, Scripture should be imperfect, it should be untainted, right? Well, what is the purpose of Scripture, and what is the actual clarifier of Scripture, which you could put to the test, right? I wouldn't say that you should look to Scripture to autistic with it and be like, oh, well, it doesn't say this, it says X plus, blah, blah, blah. No, that's silly. Especially with it being English in text. With the numerical contradictions, I can accept that. But with this, you're not going to find a contradiction, maybe, probably. And they're not syntactically contradictory. And also the idea of interpreting it this way is also silly. Now I'm going to go to one more point in here, right? And this is the point he addresses. Now applying what I talked about, hermeneutics, what do you think the author writing this thought of, right? And what do you think a person would conceive when they're talking about God and what is possible or not? So later on in the video, he talks about this paradox. You create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift itself. Were they thinking, was a Hebrew person really thinking that, oh, this means that like God can do everything, and also he can like, do things the size of the ordinals, right? He's actually the largest ordinal number, for example, and he can do every single imaginable scenario, right? Or was it talking about things, and also we see in the book of Job, more tangible and physical and logically possible? Were they thinking about like, oh, this problem, oh yes, of course he can do that, right? Or were they thinking about, oh, he's so great, right? And relative to that time, what would be great is a warrior. That's a great thing, a king, something greater than a king who can do everything that a king can do, even better than a king, right? Who can destroy the Leviathan, right? What were they thinking here? And I would say, again, this is a reason why it's a little simplistic to argue against these quotes and apply it here. What model, and if you want to be more rigorous, what mathematical model, and you can use model theory right here. You can use model theory here. What mathematical model is more likely for what omnibenevolence or omnipotence means here? What mathematical model were these scriptures getting at, and what hermeneutic interpretation do you think is more likely? I think that is a better question than just applying your own standards and saying, oh well, look at you see a paradox here, so obviously was a person really thinking about that, or are they thinking about different notions, right? A prime example of this, I would say, is John Damascus, where he talks about all-knowing middle knowledge, right? He clarifies this, and he's a saint, right? Talks about what it means to be all-knowing, right? Does God know all future outcomes? Well, here's the thing with the church. They also believe in free will. So if God knows everything, does he have free will? And a saint addressed that, and they were kind of leaning toward the idea that, well, what we mean by all-knowing, obviously, isn't talking about, like, oh, this silly notion. The Bible talks about all-knowing, and then we can interpret it this way. And for the Orthodox and Catholic Church, this is more sufficient than some guy on YouTube, some critic on YouTube, his idea of how to interpret the scripture. Right? Who gives a more nuanced view about, for example, what all-knowing is, right? And he talks about this middle knowledge type thing, right? Which is also what William Lane Craig happened. So we have a historical precedent, and it's not just to solve a paradox. And we have the principles of hermeneutics to indicate, well, I think this is a little jumpy of what you can interpret this as, right? Because we have a saint from the 7th to 8th century who addresses, who talks about a way to interpret scripture, and this is related to all-knowing knowledge, right? And he kind of like clarifies what it means, God knows everything. Well, what we mean is this, right? Right, what we mean is this. We're not talking about this. The idea talking about it is that he knows everything that exists currently and everything in the world, right? And then for the possible thing, he is all powerful, and he can do everything that could be physically possible in this world, right? Which a human cannot do. The idea of God is to express greatness, and this is what a lot of these things are talking about. It's not necessarily to form a model of God. It's saying, look how great God is. He can do anything you can think about. In the Hebrew mind, in the Greek mind, he can do everything, right? And what do the Hebrew mind think about? I don't know. They talk about killing a dragon, right? Killing a really huge sea beast. I couldn't do that, right? That's what they might say, right? Well, what he's saying is God can do it because he's so great. And that's the idea about the passage. So I think you're leaning a little too in the text. And you certainly do not have to accept this, right, as a principle. You can interpret it using hermeneutics. Now, what you ought to do, again, is to look at the models of omnipotence and see if that is a viable model.